my Spanish is worse than your English, so rest easy there. For the first time in my life, I'm going to give a presentation from a manuscript because I speak very, very rapidly and I confuse Americans and British and Australians alike. So I wanted to make sure that I slowed myself down, so I'm going to work from this. I've been making many changes and edits, so hopefully I can read my writing on my notes that I made on the airplane yesterday. But it's great to be here. My name is Dr. Aaron Sams. I'm an associate professor of education at St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania in the United States, and it's an honor to be with you all here today. This is my second time having the opportunity to give presentations in this beautiful country, and I'm excited to be back here in Madrid. Today I want to talk to you about flipped classrooms in an AI world. I've been working in the realm of flipped classrooms for almost 20 years now. It's hard to believe that it's been that long. It's been 10 years since I was last here in Spain speaking about flipped classrooms, and to be perfectly honest, I don't talk a lot about flipped classrooms anymore because I think the idea has slowly become woven into the fabric of education, and it's almost overlooked these days. The idea of teaching with video is no longer novel like it was 15 years ago. But this is exactly what I was hoping for when I started doing this work 20 years ago, simply that people would use these technologies and eventually stop talking about it. So for that, I'm very thankful. Today, I would like to frame our conversation around 3 guiding questions. And that first question is, why should we consider a flipped classroom? And in that, I will explain to you a little bit about what a flipped classroom is if you're unfamiliar with the concept. Second, I would like to talk about how does flipping promote student self-regulation. We just heard a wonderful talk about self-regulation from our colleague, and thank you so much for that insightful presentation. I'd like to build off that and explain how flipped classrooms can help facilitate self-regulation. And I'm not an expert in self-regulation by any means, so I've learned simply by reading your article that was sent to me. And third, I want to pivot, and I want to ask, how does flipping encourage responsible AI use? It's difficult to talk about educational technology these days without talking about artificial intelligence. And I believe I would be remiss if I did not try to bring this conversation into the world of artificial intelligence in which we live. So to start, we ask, why should we consider a flipped classroom? To answer that, we are going to ask another question. And that question is, why should we go to school? Why should we go to a university? What does the physical location of a college, university, or school have for us that we might not otherwise find elsewhere? Now, historically, a university has been a location for learning because that's where the books and the libraries and the experts resided. If you wanted to get access to information, you had to go to a library or to a university to get the physical copies of books that contain the information you needed, and only there would you have access to educators who would become masters in their subject area. Modern universities still have those things, those valuable things, books, libraries, and information, and professors and experts. And these are all extraordinarily valuable. However, they're no longer the only locations where we can access information. Obviously, we live in a world where access to just about any bit of information is possible. We have infinity in our pockets, on our phones, on our computers. We have access to information just about anywhere, just about any time. And to be honest, it can be a little bit overwhelming. Humans are not adapted to be bombarded with the amount of information that we encounter every day. So no longer do we have to go to a location to sit and listen to an expert and have access to information. We can get information anywhere, anytime, and we can access experts just as easily. So what value then does a school have to offer someone who is interested in learning if we can access that information anytime and anywhere? This is where I believe a flipped classroom can help bring value to the physical location, because the entire point of a flipped classroom is to maximize the face-to-face time an educator has with their students, and that time can enhance learning opportunities in ways that they would not otherwise be able to do without the expert professor or the expert teacher in the room with them. And I believe a flipped classroom is one way, to a great extent, to provide value for students at an educational institution. Now let's talk a little bit about what a flipped classroom is and how it works. As educators, we all have required curricula, things that we need to teach. There are areas of study that we are experts in as professors, and we need to teach that to our students. This required curriculum is either that which we have developed or that which an institution has decided should be taught. It consists of all the information that our students need to learn to successfully master a field of study. Now, traditionally speaking, in a typical college or university classroom, students will show up to class and they will hear their professor provide a brilliant lecture as experts in their area. Students are then sent home to practice what they have learned or to apply it in some way on their own. What a flipped classroom does is actually turn that process on its head. Instead of coming to a classroom to hear a lecture, the professor pre-records a lecture in a video format and provides that to their students to be viewed prior to the classroom time. When students get to class and they are present in the classroom space, the professor can help their students practice and apply what they have learned and hopefully help students dive deeper into the material. So rather than using class time to expose students to new information for the first time, students have already learned some of the material and the professor utilizes the recovered class time to help the students learn more deeply. In short, a flipped classroom is taking direct instruction out of the classroom time and students consume that at home, and that which was being done at home for homework is brought into the classroom, hence the flipped classroom. Now, before becoming a professor of education, I was a high school chemistry teacher, and this is where I pioneered much of this work on flipped classrooms. As a chemistry teacher, I would create video content of chemistry instruction for my students to view at home. Students then came to class and they would work on chemistry practice problems that I had previously sent home with them to do as practice. Ideally, these problems would enhance their understanding on how to apply what they had already learned. However, experience showed that many students struggle to successfully complete the work at home. So after flipping my class and moving those lectures out of the classroom, having my students practice in class, I found that my students were completing the work in a very short amount of time with a greater level of understanding. We ended up having a lot of class time remaining, and I had to figure out how I was going to use that extra class time. So with the extra class time as a science educator, I thought it would be valuable to have my students do more laboratory experiments, and so they would be able to apply what they had learned in a laboratory setting. In fact, the first year I flipped my chemistry classroom, I was able to double the number of laboratory experiments that my students would do in class, and I thought that was a remarkable leap. We now had time to be able to do many of the experiments that I had not otherwise had time to do, and it turned out there were still students who had plenty of time left because they were getting all of their work done so efficiently. They were completing all of their labs, and they were still looking for interesting chemistry activities to do. And in a high school environment, at least where I worked, I could not just release them to go do whatever they wanted to do. We had class periods of a certain number of hours, and we had to meet those hours each semester. So they had to stay in class and be with me. So I was able to have my students complete more analytical work. I was able to have them complete some quantitative chemical analysis, and students were going deeper into what they had learned in ways they had never done before. Ultimately, I had some students who would get done with all the analytical work and were still seeking an opportunity to apply knowledge to a real-world problem. And eventually, I had students designing projects and creating new things based on their knowledge of chemistry. In fact, I had one student design and build a solar-powered cell phone charger on her own that she used solar energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen molecules. She captured those gases, she passed those gases back through a fuel cell at night when the sun was not shining, and was able to charge her cell phone off of this fuel cell that she had built and designed herself. It's pretty great. This is just one example of how I got students into this creation category in my flipped classroom because I had more class time available due to the fact that I wasn't spending all my class time lecturing. I was sending lectures home for students to view on video. What I realized is that I was pushing my students to higher ends of Bloom's taxonomy and further into Webb's depth of knowledge. I was taking those bottom tiers, remembering the understanding, and I was offloading those on to video, and I was having my students engaging in higher order thinking skills in my classroom time in ways that I had not otherwise been able to do prior to flipping my classroom. So I hope that provides you with an idea of what a flipped classroom is, and I hope you can see the value of flipping and that it lies in the maximization of class time. Now, on to our second guiding question. I want to talk about how flipping promotes student self-regulation. And to answer this question, I want to ask yet another question. I have lots of questions today. More questions than I have answers. Why video? Why would I choose to take my recorded lectures and put them on a video? Could I have my students read a book? Yes, absolutely. And we've been doing that as educators for centuries. Read the book before you come to class and we'll discuss it. But to understand why video is a useful tool, we need to talk a little bit about the advent of educational technology. Now, chalk and a slate is technology. Someone somewhere grabbed a piece of calcium carbonate off of the ground and they rubbed it onto a rock and realized, oh look, I can make markings that represent the words that are coming out of my mouth. And I can put this on a dark surface and I can have my students look at that. Students can then use this technology themselves to work out problems. And so we took this new technology, chalk and slate, and we introduced it into classrooms to help students learn. And eventually we started to put these slates on as chalkboards onto classroom walls and schools everywhere. Unfortunately, to use the board, the teacher's back had to be toward the class. You don't know what's going on back there. You might have a student who is causing trouble in the back of your classroom, but you can't see them. Now, as a side note, pencils are also technology, just over 100 years old, in fact, and I'm sure there was some old curmudgeon somewhere that said slate and chalk was good enough for me when I was a kid. It's good enough for kids now. These new pencils have no place in school. Okay, despite some angry parents, pencils did, in fact, make their way into schools, in case you haven't noticed. Then, 50 or so years later, the overhead projector was developed. Now, those of you who are my age, in their 40s or 50s, you probably grew up with these in your classroom, and you probably remember teachers writing on these. And they would stand here and they would write, and they would step in front of it, they'd be blinded by the light, and they'd have to step back over here. And you could always spot a teacher because they had all of the ink on the side of their hand that they had smeared through the ink as the day went on. But this new technology was a way to present the information to our students while actually being able to look at them. We didn't have our backs here. We could actually see our students face to face rather than having our backs to them. Then a few decades later, we started to put these on the ceilings of all of our classrooms. Now, instead of writing our information on little plastic sheets with markers, we now type them into a computer and projected them onto a wall. A $100 machine and a $4 pack of markers turned into a $2,000 projector and a $1,000 computer. Eventually, we started adding interactive whiteboards to our classroom, just like this one right here. Okay, we came full circle. Teachers went from having their backs with chalk and slate to being able to see their classroom with the projectors, and now here we are again, back writing on our chalk and slate. It just happens to be electronic now. So I'm not convinced there's a whole lot of pedagogical difference between chalk and a chalkboard, an overhead projector, an LCD projector, and an interactive whiteboard, except for cost. And maybe a few things that you could do on a computer that you couldn't otherwise do with those other tools. But these are fundamentally not that different as information delivery tools. Now, when I was in Spain 10 years ago, I learned a phrase that has really stuck with me. And I learned it in Spanish, and I'm going to attempt to say it in my very, very poor Spanish. The phrase is this: Aunque la mona se vista de seda, mona se queda. Did I get it right? Okay, good. All right. All right, so I think that with a lot of educational technology, all we're doing is putting a dress on a monkey. Or in my examples, we're just dressing up a chalkboard. But it still basically functions like a chalkboard. I think, however, that video has something to offer, and it's something new, and it offers more than just a dressed up monkey. Video introduces a different way of teaching primarily because of the control that the individual has over the delivery of the content. Because of the advent of things like iPads, laptops, cell phones, individuals can control the pace at which they consume educational content, and they control the time and place where they can access the content. And they can do all of this to their own liking in ways that work for them as learners. I think these features move us in the right direction in terms of individualizing instructional options for our students, and this gives them power over their learning process. And here's where I think flipped classrooms can help promote student self-regulation by giving them autonomy of when and where and how they consume material. We're giving the students agency, and we're helping them cultivate this idea of self-regulation simply because they have to choose to do the learning themselves. If students simply show up and sit in a classroom and are passively exposed to content, there's very little agency and there's very little self-regulation other than the act of getting themselves into the classroom. By encouraging our students to access the material when they need it in time that's outside the classroom in an environment that is conducive to their learning, I believe we are in fact promoting student self-regulation. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about technology. I hear a lot of people say that technology is a tool, and I fully agree with this statement because that is the definition of technology. Taking raw materials, manipulating them into something that can help humans become more efficient or more effective at a particular task. But then I hear people trying to justify using any new technology by saying technology is only a tool. It doesn't matter what technology we're using, it's only a tool and people learn the same way regardless of the tool because the content is the same. And I don't agree with that statement. I think technology is not only a tool, technology is a tool, and some technology can be a powerful tool. However, the technologies that we choose to use in our classrooms as educators definitely impact how our students learn and who our students become. There's a quote that's often misattributed to media ecologist Marco McLuhan, but from what I can determine, it was actually Father John Culkin, who is a priest and professor of communication at Fordham University in New York City back in the mid-20th century. And the quote is this: "We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us." We become what we behold, we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. So to help us figure out what this means, let's talk about transportation. I live in Western Pennsylvania in the city of Pittsburgh. Go Steelers. There's another large city on the other side of the state called Philadelphia. They like the Eagles over there. For a comparison, let's say you're here in Madrid and you want to get to Barcelona. It's roughly the same distance from those two cities as my two cities. So I have some options. I could get in a car and I could drive from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. I could get in a bus, I could take a train, or I could take an airplane. And I can attest that I've actually used all four of these means of transportation to get from my home in Pittsburgh to the city of Philadelphia. However, depending on which of these technologies I choose, my experience as a traveler is completely different. The outcomes of my travel experience and who I am as a human on the other end of that experience is, in fact, different. If I drive a car, I'm in charge of where that car goes. If I want to pull off to the side of the road to visit a roadside attraction or to get a snack, I can do that. I have control and autonomy over the vehicle, and it takes roughly 5 hours to get from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. However, if I'm on a bus, I'm at the mercy of the driver of that bus. But I also have the opportunity to get some work done because there's free Wi-Fi on the bus. But I don't have to pay attention to the road. But it takes about 6.5 hours on the bus. The same goes for the train. In fact, we're even more restricted on a train because the train has to travel on predetermined rail that gets from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. We're also at the mercy in the United States of the freight trains that share those tracks because in the US we do not have a great rail system. If you've ever visited, do not try to travel on a train in the United States. It's not a good idea. The passenger trains actually share tracks with the freight trains, and the freight trains have the right of way, so you always wait for them. I can get snacks directly on the train because they have a dining car and they have Wi-Fi, so I can get some work done, but it takes about 7.5 hours to get from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia on the train. Now, flying is probably the fastest way to get there. But it has the added stress of getting to the airport in Pittsburgh, getting out of the airport in Philadelphia, the stress of sitting around at the airport, the potential of delayed flights, and so on and so forth. My own daughter is currently sitting in San Jose, Costa Rica in the airport because her flight to the US got canceled and she spent the night on the floor in the airport. So she is learning about airport delays the hard way. So the technology that I choose for my travel will determine my experience as a traveler, and it will shape me as a human being at the end of that travel experience. Now, the same thing goes for educational media. If I read a book, if I listen to a lecture, or if I watch a video about a lecture, yes, I have access to the same content. However, my experience as a learner is going to be different based on the technology that is used. So when we select technologies in our educational settings, we have to be careful that we are in fact choosing technologies that benefit our students. And again, for the purpose of today's conversation, help them become more self-regulated learners. And to further promote self-regulation, we can go so far as to give our students options for the way they will learn the content. These could all be viable options for our students. So let's now look at how flipped learning is a form of pre-learning. This idea of pre-learning is that we are giving our students something to learn prior to coming to class. Before they come to class, they're going to engage more deeply with the content in class with the teacher expert in the room. And flipping is a form of pre-learning in a similar way that reading a textbook before you come to class and discussing it in class is also a form of pre-learning. Are they identical? No. They utilize different technologies, and as such, they are going to shape us differently as learners, but they are certainly both forms of pre-learning. So which types of content are most conducive to pre-learning? I would argue that that video is conducive to pre-learning for the how-to and procedural types of content. Those are very suited to video because they focus on basic instructions on how to perform very basic things like mathematical calculations, instructions on grammar, basic instruction on some, let's say, basic chemistry like I taught, or whatever your field happens to be. You know what the basics are, the foundational material is. As experts, you know what those basic elements are, and I encourage you to figure out what might lend itself best to video. So again, another way to describe that is simply to flip the basic information of your field. You don't have to flip everything. You don't have to put all instruction on video. If I believe that all lectures should be recorded and never given live, I would not be standing here giving you a live lecture right now. I would have recorded this at home, sent you a video, and never would have gotten to visit here. But if we think back to Bloom's taxonomy, that's remembering and the understanding phases, those bottom two tiers, those are the things that lend themselves well to being put on an instructional video. So another question then, and this is probably the most often asked questions of people who are considering a flipped classroom, is what do I do in class if I offload the lectures? You might say to yourself, I've been lecturing for so long and I'm really good at it. I know my field, and if I put that on video, what am I going to do in class instead? Well, hopefully you're engaging your students in higher order thinking. As I mentioned, when I introduced the concept of the flipped classroom, I explained to you various ways that I was able to engage my students in higher order thinking. And I would encourage you to think about how you could do that and what it might look like in your field. Now, additionally, I want to mention that flipping can also allow for, once you have a library of video content, it can allow for an asynchronous, mastery-oriented classroom in which students control the pace of their learning. And that's an another topic. I actually have a second book that explains that entirely, so you can read that if you feel like it, or I can explain it to you over lunch sometime. But once you have a library of video, students can move through the content at a pace that's most appropriate to them, rather than having everyone do the same thing on the same track. It's outside of the scope of what I want to talk about today, but it's out there, and I encourage you to look into that. But ultimately, the idea of pre-learning is that we're offloading the lower aspects of Bloom's to the individual learners so we can have a more active excuse me, I can't talk today, a more active classroom. And in doing so, we're encouraging self-regulation through the delivery of content, and we're giving students great autonomy in promoting their own self-regulation by providing creative outlets in our flipped classrooms. Now, my more active classroom, as I mentioned, involved a lot of practice, application, analysis, and creation, and a lot of just doing of chemistry, rather than learning about chemistry. And again, I would encourage you to determine what an active classroom might look like in the field in which you are an expert. I want to now transition in our talk about how an active classroom can become an AI-resistant classroom, an artificial intelligence resistant classroom, meaning a classroom in which we can engage our students in AI-resistant assignments. Another way of describing that is asking how we can have our students engaged in our classrooms in activities that they cannot simply input into a prompt into a chatbot like ChatGPT and have ChatGPT generate the response for them. Doing that is offloading the work to a machine rather than doing it themselves. But in an active classrooms are human-centered classrooms. And human-centered classrooms can be resistant to the temptation of taking the shortcut of offloading one's work to AI. So this brings us to our third question. How does flipping encourage responsible AI use? So to talk about that, let's talk about a few issues surrounding AI. And I will be referring primarily to large language models when I say AI, things like ChatGPT, things like Claude, things like Gemini. Okay? I know there are other applications of AI. I'm not going to be addressing those but because this is primarily what is impacting our students in university classrooms. So as someone who works in the education technology space, I often hear people promoting the idea of artificial intelligence as a learning companion for students. Now, a little over a year ago, there was an article that was put online by Kevin Hodek from Michigan State University. It's kind of an AI watch website that he runs. And I want to read this to you. One possible way to support student learning is using AI agents as learning partners. However, understanding which supports to offer should be informed by the goal of the interaction and the learning theory. AI, especially generative AI, has an emerging role as a new type of learning partner by adapting educational experiences to individual needs, cool, and helping students develop deeper understanding, even better. This concept is rooted in learning frameworks like constructivism, where students apply and build knowledge from their experiences, and Vygotsky's scaffolding, good stuff, where more knowledge others support learners until they can perform tasks independently. Further theories of distributed cognition and situated learning emphasize how learning tools like AI extend cognitive abilities and make learning contextually relevant. That sounds amazing. If we can take an AI tool and it can be our learning partner because it's more knowledgeable and it can support our learners, that sounds like a great idea. However, early this year, roughly 1 year after that was written and put out by Michigan State, the MIT Media Lab released a study where they took PET scans and they analyzed the brain activity of learners who either used no LLM, no AI, who used LLMs, who used AI, and students who just use internet search. Now, I will leave you to read this article, but one of their conclusions was this. While large language models, or AI, offer immediate convenience, our findings highlight potential cognitive costs. Over 4 months, LLM users consistently underperformed at neural, linguistic, and behavioral levels. The results raise concerns about the long-term educational implications of LLM reliance and need for deeper inquiry into AI's role into learning. That is not the promise of this article. That is in fact the opposite that other one promised. So I don't know about you, but this gives me pause in promoting this idea of AI as a learning partner. This article seems to imply that students who rely too heavily on their AI companion actually become dumber. That's frightening as an educator. Okay. Now, I think about learning alongside AI in the same way that I think about physical fitness. Now, I'm not an expert in physical fitness, obviously. I do go to the gym and I do know that it's hard work, but I also know that in order to see noticeable progress in the gym, you actually have to work really hard. There is no way to get stronger muscles without lifting weights. There is no way to get faster without running. This is the same with our brains. There was no way to get smarter without thinking. So if we offload our thinking to a machine, we are not doing the thinking ourselves. The output of using the machine might be the same. It might actually be better. AI is getting to the point where it might be able to write a better paper than I might be able to write. However, if I rely on chatbots and LLMs, I as the learner have not done the learning, and therefore I did not learn. And I would have a hard time actually calling myself a learner. And what I'm finding is that my students are running to these LLMs because it's easy, because it's convenient, it gets them done with the assignment faster, and if we are only concerned about the output of learning, and if we're only thinking in a consequentialist way, rather than thinking about the learning in a virtuous way, then we run the risk of robbing our students of valuable learning experiences. So what I want to do now is, in the time I have left, is I want to frame the rest of this presentation under the framework of what are called the transcendentals. Now, as I mentioned, I teach at St. Vincent College. It's a small Catholic liberal arts undergraduate institution, and I'm the product of a liberal arts education. I did my undergrad at a small liberal arts institution, and I now teach at one. So I figured, why not lean into that experience? Now, at St. Vincent, in addition to my education classes, I teach a seminar class in our core foundational curriculum. And in there, we read a lot of the ancients, and one of the things we talk about in liberal arts education are the transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. You can find these concepts in ancient Greek thought, in Plato and Aristotle. You can find these ideas in various religious traditions, including Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, to name a few. But throughout human history and traditions, these three concepts tend to coalesce as truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, I only recently started thinking about AI through the lens of the transcendentals, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this is probably what I most have to offer to the conversation around AI and education. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach various aspects of artificial intelligence, things that I've been testing, things that I've been working on for the past few years, and I'm going to pass them through these three lenses. Is it true? Is it good? And is it beautiful? I'm going to start with asking the question, is it true? And for our purposes today, I'm going to define that as, does it reflect reality? Now, as we all know, AI is applied statistics. So we're dealing with mathematical algorithms. We're dealing with calculations. We're dealing with probabilities that are predicting what is the next most likely word that should be generated and produced in the output. And in the early stages of these large language models, like ChatGPT and Google Gemini, there were a lot of hallucinations going on. And if you've spent any time with AI, you know what I'm talking about. You type something in, and absolute, utter nonsense is produced. So when AI produces something like this, it's pretty clear that something not true is represented. Something out of the norm is going on. Something is being produced that does not reflect reality. Now, fortunately, AI is getting better about these hallucinations. It doesn't seem to produce them as often or as egregiously, at least not that I'm encountering as much. So that's a good thing. But I'm a little more concerned about some of the other aspects relating to truth. If you've used any generative AI tools, you have no doubt seen the disclaimers on the main page. Something like, AI can be biased. Generative AI is experimental. AI can produce wrong results. Check for accuracy. Oddly, I can't think of any other industry for which we allow this margin of error to be acceptable. So, if you know me, you will quickly learn that I really enjoy beer. Okay, I make beer at home. I'm a certified beer judge, and one of my favorite things to do is to visit small breweries to try different styles of beer. Now, it would be a bit of a shock if I went to a brewery and I ordered a lager, and as the bartender started to pour from the tap, she says, now, just so you know, this might not actually be beer. I mean, what would it be? Are there random pipes coming from the auto shop next door, and it's going to be a liter of motor oil, or the bleach factory down the street is sometimes comes into the beer lines? It's ridiculous. Another way of looking at this is, if I am driving over one of the many bridges where I live in Pittsburgh and I see a sign that says use caution, sometimes the bridge is in Iberico ham. It's absurd, but we just seem to tolerate it with the AI industry. What is produced might not be the thing that you've asked it to produce. So I'm hopeful that as it pertains to truth, that AI will continue to improve. And I've really appreciated that about some of the newer versions of AI that are coming out. And so I see improvements, and I'm encouraged that these models will continue to develop that they'll produce content that is more true, and that they will stop lying to us when clearly a guardrail has been put in place to prevent people from accessing a particular bit of information. So I think when we ask this question, is it true? Does it reflect reality that these models are getting better, and they think they're reflecting reality more than they have in the past? And I do think that is a good thing. Now, one of the benefits of a flipped classroom is obviously the amount of time you get back in the class period instead of lecturing to do other things with your students. And given the fact that our students are often ignorant of what they do not know, they don't know whether or not what is being produced by a large language model or an AI chatbot is actually real, or if it represents reality, because they just don't know enough about it. So as flipped educators, we can leverage our redeemed class time, and we can dig much deeper into the content with our students so they do become experts and can discern whether or not what they're seeing is, in fact, true. To do that, we can focus on what is being called now AI literacy. We obviously want to teach our students to be able to detect whether or not something produced by AI is true, in the same way that we've been teaching them digital literacy and training them to look at different sources, to look for bias, and to look for whether the article they are reading may or may not map onto the world around them. We can do the same thing with AI, but it's a little more difficult in that AI is producing content and it doesn't necessarily cite its sources. Now, granted, ChatGPT and Gemini and others are now finally starting to bring the information and cite the sources where it's pulling their the summaries from. And I think that is helpful and encouraging. And this will hopefully mean that AI literacy is going to become easier, and that sources of bias and truth will become more transparent. But as we work with our students and train them on how to use these models, teaching them to identify these things and not just simply taking the product at face value is how we can start to help our students determine if what has been produced is, in fact, true. Okay, transcendental number 2. Is it good? Now, there are a lot of ways we can describe goodness, but the approach I'm going to take here is using Aristotle's golden mean. And as you know, the golden mean strives to find virtue between two vices. A classic example of this is the virtue of bravery. You have cowardice on one side, you have carelessness on the other side, and bravery or courage is in the middle. That would be the golden mean, the desirable characteristic that we're working toward. There was a study that came out in 2018. It was called the Gender Studies Project, and that set out to determine whether facial recognition AI was biased. In the study, the researchers categorized people into two categories: skin tone and sex. They sorted people by either having light skin or dark skin, and whether they were male or female. What they determined was that the AI was more likely to correctly identify light-skinned males and were most likely to misidentify dark-skinned females. So what we have here is a bias problem baked into this particular AI solution. Now, if you go forward a few years, Google Gemini, when it first came out, ran into quite a scandal when they were clearly trying to shift in the other direction from the racial bias problem. So rather than risk misidentifying or underrepresenting people with darker skin or females, they trained or possibly programmed Google Gemini when it first came out to prioritize image generation of people of color and women. Now, on face value, that's an admirable goal. But I think they swung too far and overcorrected for the problem. And as you can see here in this article from Al Jazeera, that probably the most egregious thing here is that it has images of brown people wearing World War II Nazi uniforms with swastikas on them, and clearly that's a problem. What seemed to have happened is that in order to try to have representation of the underrepresented, Google created something that overrepresented people who were otherwise underrepresented, and in doing so created some rather egregious images. Now, you may have noticed that Gemini stopped producing images of people shortly thereafter. So this is an example of two extremes of underrepresentation and overrepresentation. If we look for the golden mean would
would be neither of those two. The golden mean would be accurate and adequate representation. So that's a challenge. But let's try to find what the golden mean could look like in education. Recently, I was working with a reading specialist who happens to also be my wife. She had been encouraged by her administration to utilize AI tools to create some reading passages for her struggling young students. Now, my wife works in a school that is primarily Black and African American, and the idea was to produce passages in which students would find representation of themselves or their experiences. So what we did is we created a prompt that said, write a short story about life in Pittsburgh as an African American child. We ran it through an LLM called Magic School, which is an educational AI tool. And I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs of what it produced. Once upon a time in a big city called Pittsburgh, there lived a young girl named Maya. She was a bright and happy African-American child. Maya lived in a cozy house with her family. They had a big backyard where she played with their friends. Every day after school, Maya would walk to the park with her best friend Jamal. They loved to play on the swings and slides. Sometimes they would sit on the grass and talk about their dreams. I'm going to jump to the bottom. After a while, Maya and Jamal got hungry. They found a booth selling tasty treats. Can I have some of that yummy cornbread? Maya asked. The lady behind the counter smiled and gave her a big piece. You got it, sweetie. She said. Jamal chose some barbecue ribs and they both sat on a bench enjoying their food. Now, it's fine. It's an okay, lovely little story. And something that you might miss, not living in the United States, is that it probably errs on the side of some racial stereotypes, especially as it relates to food. Now, my wife agreed and said, I can't use that in my classroom. There's no way. I will definitely have some negative responses from parents if I use that story in my class because of some of the stereotypes that were in the product. So we took that prompt and we ran it through ChatGPT. Here's what ChatGPT produced. In the heart of Pittsburgh, where the hills roll like waves of the river, there lived a boy named Malik. He was just 10 years old, but his spirit was bigger than the skyline that sparked against the twilight. Every morning, Malik would wake up to the sound of his mama humming in the kitchen. The aroma of grits and fried bologna filled the air, wrapping around him like a warm hug. Get up, Malik, breakfast ain't gonna eat itself, she'd call out with her smooth voice like molasses. Stop there. I'll find where I left off on my paper. I got lost. Here we go. So, not much better on the food front. This particular article also contains a lot of the same stereotypes that the previous one did. Again, not surprising that these are so similar because Magic School, the first one we used, is built on top of ChatGPT, which we used here. So it has the same underlying engine that's producing the content. So next we decided to see if ChatGPT using DALL-E could create us an image of an African-American family eating dinner because apparently ChatGPT just likes to talk about food. So we simply typed create an image of an African-American family eating dinner, and the image it created was so egregiously stereotyped that I will not show it to you today. We realized that this was a problem and my wife was unable to use any of the stories. She was not able to use the image. So are mediocre stereotypes the golden mean? Is ChatGPT and DALL-E the answer to the extremes we saw earlier? I hope not. This is more like the mediocre middle than the golden mean. So being a middle-aged white guy, it's really difficult for me to talk about things as it pertains to race, so I try to stay in my lane. But fortunately, I have a classmate of mine from my PhD program who specializes in the connections between race, family histories, and education. Her name is Dr. Alitha R. Cherry, and as I mentioned, we did our PhDs together. We've collaborated on many projects and presentations together, and she's an absolutely amazing person, and I knew this is a person I could reach out to and ask some difficult questions, and I knew I could trust her to give me straightforward, helpful answers. That's exactly what I did. So I showed her the image that ChatGPT produced, and I showed her the stories that were produced, and she said, oh, yeah, that's not good. So again, if we're asking our transcendental question, is it good? According to Dr. Cherry, no, it is not good. Now, fortunately, she has been working with some new AI tools that I was unaware of, and she showed me a new tool called Latimer. Now, Latimer is really interesting, and according to their website, it's built to more accurately reflect the experience, culture, and history of Black and brown people because it's been trained on stories specifically from various groups who might otherwise not be represented in broader the broader internet that the chatbots were trained on. So Dr. Cherry took the stories that I wrote and the image that I produced, and she ran those things through Latimer, and Latimer cleaned it up. And this is what Latimer produced. In the heart of Pittsburgh, where the rivers met and the hills rolled, there lived a young boy named Jamal. He was 10 years old, but he had dreams bigger than the skyline of the city. Jamal lived in the Hill District, a very specific neighborhood, historically speaking, for African Americans in Pittsburgh, a place with rich history and the beat of jazz that flowed through it, through the streets like river. Hugely influential on early American jazz music. So they're taking the culture of this community and baking it into the story rather than just throwing in all the food stereotypes. This particular thing that was trained on material that does in fact represent those students and produced a much, much better output. So Dr. Cherry also ran the entire story through an image creation AI tool called Midjourney, and these are the images that it produced. Much better. I'm fine showing you these images. I would say way better than the ones ChatGPT produced. The story that Latimer produced was far more nuanced, and rather than playing to the broad stereotypical middle or the mediocre middle, it created a much more complex and rich canvas on which the story was painted. Latimer and Midjourney seem to have been tuned in such a way that they can take the mediocre middle and elevate it to the golden mean. So I believe by examining the various outputs that different large language models and image generators are capable of producing, that we can help our students in a flipped classroom grow in moral character. Now, this is not typically something that's associated with flipped classrooms. However, I think if we can take our students through exercises of trying to get LLMs to produce material that may be controversial, that they can examine those outputs, and we can guide them through an evaluation process to help them understand why some of these tools produce better or worse content, why there might be bias baked into the system. We can help our students understand from a moral perspective that these AI models are not neutral, and that they have all of the biases of humanity trained into them. And we as humans have to learn how to be able to navigate that difficult world and parse the good from the offensive, the good from the detrimental to society, and be able to regulate not only what we do with the AI models, but what we do with their outputs. So when we ask ourselves the question, is it good? Have we reached that golden mean? Have we reached a level of achieving what we want from the prompt without playing to either edge and without just watering it down to some stereotype? I think that yes, by using things like Latimer and Midjourney rather than some of the other tools that we started with, we were able to produce a higher quality product, a better product. So when this comes back to your students, to you and your students, you can tune your AI to elevate the product as well. Take advantage of those thumbs up and thumbs down buttons in a process that I would like to call reject, refine, and regulate. When something is produced that is abysmal, give it a thumbs down. When something is produced that just propagates more stereotypes, give it a thumbs down. Then refine the thing, maybe run it through a different AI model, maybe ask it for more or ask it to adjust things, maybe tell the AI, no, I don't like this, you did this and that, and I need you to fix it. Fortunately, AI is really good at pleasing humans, something it does very, very well. So by refining the process and refining the prompts to create the product that we actually want, we're more likely to get things that are, in fact, good. The third question we want to ask of AI is it beautiful? And I'm going to define this as, does it invoke awe? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but a while ago I asked ChatGPT-4 using DALL-E to produce an image of a young lady in glasses sitting on a bridge and one of a ballerina dancing on a bridge. And this is what it produced. Now, don't get me wrong, it is really cool that you can just type those simple phrases into a text box and a computer will produce those images. Okay, that's impressive, that's fascinating, and it's a technological marvel, and I don't want to overlook the fact that these powerful tools can do that. However, when you look at those images, and then you look at these two images, you realize there's something completely different going on. A computer creating images based on a prompt absolutely cannot compare to the beauty of my daughters against the backdrop of the architecture and engineering of my city captured by the skill of a professional photographer. When we talk about beauty, when we talk about awe, the images made by AI pale in comparison to the ones that can be produced by a human, of humans, around beautiful things created by humans. So I'm a little skeptical of these large language models and on AI image generation, in case you can't tell. However, AI in general, I think, is truly remarkable. It's helping to diagnose cancer years before it would be detectable by a human. It's helping to create rockets that are reusable. It's going to continue to help make many aspects of our lives more efficient and more effective. But I was flipping through Instagram the other day and I saw a random meme that very poignantly summarized my feelings about AI. It said, I want AI to do my laundry and the dishes. I do not want it to write poetry and to create art. So when we're selecting our tools for AI, we need to select the ones that are helping us with efficiency, but are not robbing us of humanity, nor trying to make things beautiful, knowing that computers can't do that. Creating beautiful things is fundamentally a human thing to do. When we ask the question, is it beautiful and does it invoke awe, I believe that things created by humans, of humans, will always surpass the beauty of things created by a robot. And because things created by humans will always surpass the beauty of things created by a robot, I believe we can use our redeemed class time in a flipped classroom to experience the beautiful things that humans and that nature have to offer. Specifically, I think we should use our flipped classrooms to experience art, to experience music, and to have our students experience nature. These are all things of beauty created by humans or by an almighty creator that, in my opinion, will always surpass those things created by a machine. Different subject areas will lend themselves more or less to these different areas, and some will fit better with seeking truth, others with seeking goodness, and others with seeking beauty. But flipping unlocks the opportunity to explore these transcendentals. So I want to leave you with a few thoughts as we wrap up. There's a famous quote by American author Mark Twain that says, "A man who carries a cat by the tail learns a lesson he can learn in no other way." And I think that Mark Twain cleverly was saying the best way of learning is learning by doing. And that's the same as Dewey's idea of experiential learning. And I think all learning is, in fact, experiential. And learning is the most fundamentally human thing that can be done. And we don't want to rob our students of the experience of learning and the process of learning. And I think the temptation with AI is that we can rob ourselves of opportunities for growth, and we can rob our students of opportunities for learning. I think about this presentation. I could have input the description of the talk through ChatGPT and trusted the machine to make a presentation and a script. But I would have robbed myself of the opportunity to grow, to get frustrated, to iterate, to self-regulate, and to completely start over a few times. I would have missed out on becoming a better person and giving you a much better talk. So I want to leave you with a few final thoughts about what I believe our responsibility as educators are in this world of AI, of inherently biased AI, an AI that we're trying to determine if it produces things that are true, things that are good, and things that are beautiful. The first is that AI literacy is at least equivalent to media literacy and might be even more important. We must help our students interpret whether the outputs of AI are true, are real, or are legitimate. This is as important as students being able to consume and determine the legitimacy of all other forms of media. The second, we need to build assignments that leverage AI. AI is not going anywhere, and it will continue to permeate our lives. We need to have our students have experiences with AI that are rich, that are meaningful, and that help them learn how it operates, how it functions, and how it works, and what it can and cannot do. We need to create assignments that get students pointed in that direction. The next thing I think we need to continue to build analog assignments that are AI proof, things that cannot be done by using AI. As I was preparing this presentation, I was sitting in a chair in our basement surrounded by a pile of paints, half-done paintings, and paintbrushes. My daughter, the dancer who you saw earlier, she is also an artist and has been paid professionally to create art for a children's book as a high school student. She could have very easily used some sort of AI image generation, but she wanted to do it by hand, and it took her a lot of time. If you price it out per hour that she worked, she really didn't make all that much money. But the process that she went through and the experience that she had to produce these paintings for this book was unlike anything that she will ever experience again. And as educators, we cannot rob our students of those experiences, those analog experiences that AI absolutely cannot do, because they make us better humans. Next, I think we need to prioritize technique over technology. Using technology to become more efficient is one thing, but having mastered a technique to be able to do something is superior to offloading it to a machine and is fundamentally more human. So what are some examples of that? First off, encourage students to do things the hard way. Now that doesn't mean they always have to do things the hard way. In fact, we all grew up with calculators, and sometimes we had to do math without calculators, and our teachers would say, you're never going to have a calculator in your pocket all the time, and now we have a calculator in our pocket all the time. I think there's great value in being efficient in doing mathematics, but there's also great value in knowing the theory that goes into it so we know what is going on inside the calculator. So it's not just a black box producing information. So learning to do things the hard way, learning to do things step by step manually is an important way to train ourselves in understanding the way that things are done in an automated fashion so that we never take those for granted. And a wise, self-regulated person knows when to do the math the easy way and when to do the math the hard way. Finally, I think we need to emphasize the process over the product. When I teach my classes to my students, I can assign a paper to write as a product. I can give them an assignment, write a paper on this topic. One of the hardest things I have to try to convince my students is that when they write a paper for my class, the point is not to produce the paper. The point is to go through the process of writing the paper, and that is where the learning happens. To prevent students from simply taking the prompt, dropping it into ChatGPT, having it produce a paper and turning it in, I have them go through a writing process where they create an outline. They find sources. They submit the outline and the sources to me. I review their outline. I give them feedback. They have a process of writing a draft. They undergo a process of reviewing that with their peers. They then have the draft that's submitted to me. I review it again before they submit their final product. Teaching them and showing them that the process of writing is the process of learning and that the product that is produced is not the point. This is a lot more work on my part. In this respect, AI has not made me more efficient. Pushing against the AI has made me less efficient, but it makes my students better learners. So prioritizing process over product is one way that we can avoid the temptation of taking the easy way out with AI and emphasizing to our students that learning is, in fact, important. So I know this is kind of a weird way to approach AI. We go to a lot of conferences, we hear a lot of talks just like cheering AI and saying it's going to change things. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think it's amazing, it has a lot of potential, but it's not where we need it to be yet to come along as a learning companion. What I want to do is I want to encourage you to join me to continually evaluate AI tools as to whether they are producing the outputs that are true, whether they're generating products that are good, and whether they are making things that are beautiful. And I hope that I've answered our three guiding questions. Why should we consider a flipped classroom? Ultimately, it's to get back valuable class time to engage students in higher order thinking skills. The second question, how does flipping promote self-regulation? We're giving control of the learning process to our students. And three, how does flipping encourage responsible AI use? It provides time to explore AI platforms, and the transcendentals provide an ethical filter through which the AI can be evaluated. Thank you.